Dusk was slowly falling on the luxurious Blackwood estate on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts. The autumn wind rustled the leaves of the century-old oak trees that surrounded the 20-acre property, creating an unsettling symphony that seemed to foreshadow things to come. In his home office, located on the second floor of the stately Georgian mansion, Jonathan Blackwood sat behind a massive mahogany desk. The 45-year-old tech magnate and founder of Quantum Leap Industries was completely engrossed in studying the financial reports laid out before him. Jonathan frowned, his piercing blue eyes scanning the rows of numbers. Something didn't add up, and he couldn't figure out what it was. He'd been noticing minor discrepancies in the reports for the past few months, but today, for the first time, the discrepancies formed a disturbing pattern. He leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his temples. Outside, the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, but Jonathan barely noticed the beauty. His mind was elsewhere. "What's going on here?" he muttered under his breath, getting up from the table and walking over to the picture window. Jonathan glanced at the manicured gardens that stretched all the way to the wrought iron gates of the estate. Everything looked perfect, as always. But behind this facade of perfection, he felt that something was wrong, and this feeling haunted him not only in business. For the past few months, Jonathan had noticed strange changes in the behavior of his closest circle. His wife, Emily, seemed to have become more distant. They had been married for 15 years, and Jonathan had always been proud of their closeness and understanding. But now, Emily seemed to avoid his gaze. She often canceled their plans together, citing headaches or meetings with friends. And when they did spend time together, Jonathan felt a tension that he had never felt before. His longtime friend and the CFO of Quantum Leap Industries, Michael Sterling, had changed too. They had known each other since their student days at MIT, starting businesses together, overcoming challenges and celebrating successes. Michael had always been open and honest, but lately he had become unusually secretive. Several times Jonathan had caught him engaged in strange phone conversations that would abruptly end when he walked into the room. Even the servants who had worked at the mansion for years now acted wary in his presence. Conversations would die down when he walked into the room, and he noticed a strange look in the eyes of some of the employees, a mixture of guilt and fear. Jonathan sighed and returned to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer and took out an old framed photograph. It was of him and Emily on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so in love. Where had it all gone? He was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," Jonathan said, quickly putting the photograph back in the drawer. Susan, his personal assistant, had been with him for 7 years and had always been a model of efficiency and loyalty. But today, Jonathan noticed that her usually confident gaze was slightly nervous. "Mr. Blackwood, I have brought the reports you asked for," she said, handing him a folder. Jonathan took the documents, watching Susan carefully. "Thank you, Susan. How are the preparations for the presentation of the new project going?" "Everything is going according to plan, sir," she replied, but Jonathan noticed her eyes briefly shifting. "Mr. Sterling asked me to tell you that he would like to discuss some details with you tomorrow morning." "Okay. Tell him I will be in the office at 9. Jonathan nodded. As Susan turned to leave, he added, "And Susan, if there's anything you want to tell me, my office is always open. You know that, right?" Susan froze for a moment, and Jonathan swore he saw her flinch. But when she turned back to him, she had her usual professional smile on her face. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you. Have a nice evening," she said as she left the office. Jonathan stared at the closed door for a long moment. Something was definitely wrong, and he was determined to find out. He turned back to the window, watching the last glimmer of daylight disappear over the horizon. Then it hit him. If he wanted to know the truth, He needed to become invisible, to blend into the background. He needed to become someone no one noticed. "I'm going to be my own security guard," Jonathan whispered, his lips curling into a determined smile. "No one will suspect the richest man in New England of being a mere security guard. It's the perfect disguise." He turned to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Susan, get me my attorney, Richard Hawthorne. Tell him I have business of the utmost importance to see him at his office tomorrow at 3 o'clock." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Anything else?" Susan's voice called back. "No, that's all. Thank you," Jonathan replied, disconnecting the intercom. He sat back down at his desk and opened his laptop. He spent the next few hours meticulously researching security services, surveillance techniques, and intelligence-gathering methods. If he was going to play the role of a security guard, he had to do it convincingly. It was well past midnight when Jonathan finally rose from his desk. He felt exhausted, but also determined. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and he was ready for whatever it might bring. As he left his office, he took one last look at the photographs on the walls. They chronicled his success story, from Quantum Leap Industries' first office in a garage to the grand opening of their skyscraper in downtown Boston. But now, the images seemed foreign to Jonathan, as if they belonged to another life. He walked slowly down the wide marble stairs, listening to the silence of the house. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the muffled sound of a television, probably one of the night guards passing the time watching the late news. Jonathan headed for the bedroom wing of the house. As he passed Emily's room, he noticed a sliver of light under the door. He paused for a moment, raised his hand to knock, but then thought better of it. What could he say? How could he explain his suspicions without any proof? Instead, he went to his bedroom. Closing the door behind him, Jonathan walked to the huge window that looked out onto the backyard of the estate. The moon lit up the manicured lawns and winding garden paths. Everything looked so peaceful, so perfect, and yet Jonathan knew there was a secret behind that facade, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The next morning started earlier than usual for Jonathan. He woke before dawn, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Today was the day he would put his plan into action. After a quick shower and changing into his usual business suit, Jonathan went down to the dining room. To his surprise, Emily was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and reading something on her tablet. "Good morning," Jonathan said, trying to sound casual. Emily looked up, and for a moment Jonathan thought he saw something akin to guilt in her eyes. But the expression disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Good morning, dear," she replied with a small smile. "You're early today. Important meeting." Jonathan poured himself a coffee and sat down across from his wife. "Yeah, I have a few things to take care of before the presentation of the new project. What are your plans for today?" Emily hesitated for a second before answering. "Oh, nothing special. I'm going to meet Laura for lunch and then maybe stop by the gallery. They've received some new works that might be good for the living room." Jonathan nodded, watching his wife's expression carefully. Was it true, or was she hiding something? He'd never doubted Emily's words before, but now everything seemed suspicious. "That sounds great," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "How about we have dinner tonight? It's been a while since we've gone out." Emily hesitated again, and Jonathan felt his heart clench. "Sorry, honey, but I promised my mother I'd stop by tonight. Maybe another time." Jonathan nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "Sure, no problem. Tell her I said hi." The rest of breakfast passed in awkward silence. As Jonathan stood up to leave, Emily suddenly said, "Jonathan, are you okay? You've seemed a little tense lately." For a moment, Jonathan considered telling her his suspicions, but something stopped him. Instead, he smiled and said, "I'm fine. Just a lot of work. Don't worry." With that, he kissed his wife on the cheek and left the house. As Jonathan climbed into his black Mercedes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just missed an important moment. The day at the office had passed in a blur. Jonathan went through his duties mechanically, attended meetings and answered calls, but his mind was elsewhere. He had watched Michael Sterling closely during their morning meeting, trying to catch any signs of nervousness or deception. But Michael was, as always, professional and collected. When the clock struck 2:30, Jonathan excused himself and left the office, telling Susan that he had an important meeting outside the company. He noticed her glance at Michael as he walked past, but decided to ignore it, at least for now. Richard Hawthorne's office was in downtown Boston, in an old red brick building. When Jonathan walked into the reception area, Richard's secretary immediately showed him into his office. Richard Hawthorne, a tall man in his 60s with graying temples and a keen eye, rose from his desk to greet his client. "Jonathan, it's good to see you," he said, shaking Blackwood's hand. "Your assistant told me you had a matter of the utmost importance. What is it?" Jonathan sat down in the chair opposite Richard's desk and took a deep breath. "Richard, what I am about to tell you must remain strictly between us. I trust you not only as my lawyer, but as my friend." Richard frowned and nodded. "Of course, Jonathan. You know you can trust me." Jonathan spent the next half hour telling Richard about his suspicions, the strange behavior of the people around him, and the discrepancies in the company's financial statements. When he had finished, he outlined his plan. "I'd like to temporarily step away from running Quantum Leap Industries and become a security guard at my own home," Jonathan said, watching Richard's reaction carefully. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Jonathan, are you sure you want to do this? This sounds, well, unusual." Jonathan nodded, his gaze hard. "I'm absolutely sure, Richard. Something's going on, and I need to find out what it is. I need you to prepare the necessary paperwork. The official line is that I'm taking an extended medical leave of absence and going to Europe for treatment." Richard sighed but began taking notes. "What about your new identity? You realize that you might be recognized." "I've already thought of that," Jonathan replied, pulling a photograph from his inside jacket pocket. It showed a middle-aged man with a thick beard and thick-rimmed glasses. "That's me, after a little makeover. Call me Jack Thornton." Richard studied the photograph and nodded slowly. "Impressive. But do you realize how dangerous this is? If anyone discovers your deception—" Jonathan interrupted him. "There is always a risk, Richard, but I need to know the truth. Prepare paperwork for Jack Thornton, an ex-military man seeking work in security. And please contact the security company we usually hire. Tell them that I personally recommended this man for the position of new guard at the mansion." Richard was silent for a moment, considering Jonathan's words. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, Jonathan. I will do everything as you ask, but be careful. If your suspicions are correct, you could be in grave danger." "I'll be careful," Jonathan assured him. "And thank you, Richard. I knew I could count on you." It was getting dark when Jonathan left Richard's office. He got into his car, but he didn't start the engine. Instead, he took out his phone and dialed a number. "Hello?" came a female voice on the other end of the line. "Hi, Mom," Jonathan said. "How are you?" "Jonathan, what a pleasant surprise. I'm fine, dear. What's wrong? You rarely call at this hour." Jonathan hesitated for a moment. "Mom, Emily said she was coming to visit you this evening. I just wanted to make sure you were okay and didn't need anything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Emily? No, honey, she didn't say she was coming. I have a book club meeting tonight." Jonathan felt his heart tighten. "Oh, I must have gotten something wrong. Sorry to bother you, Mom. Have a nice evening." He ended the call and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. Emily had lied to him. But why? Where was she really planning on spending the evening? At that moment, Jonathan's resolve was made. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Jonathan Blackwood stood in front of the mirror in his spacious walk-in closet, carefully studying his reflection. It was the last time he would see himself as the successful businessman he was accustomed to. In a few hours, the billionaire would disappear, replaced by the unassuming security guard, Jack Thornton. With a heavy sigh, Jonathan ran a hand through his short, graying hair. He knew that the first step in his transformation would be a change in hairstyle. On the table next to the mirror lay the hair dye kit he had secretly purchased a few days ago. "Well, time to get started," he muttered under his breath, opening the box of dye. Jonathan spent the next hour painstakingly applying dark brown dye to his hair and the beard he had been growing for the past few weeks under the guise of a new look for the company. The process was tedious and unfamiliar to a man accustomed to having a personal stylist, but Jonathan understood the need for secrecy. When he washed the dye out and dried his hair, a completely different man stared back at him in the mirror. The dark hair and thick beard alone had made a big difference to his appearance, but Jonathan knew that it wasn't enough. The next step was contact lenses that changed the color of his eyes. Jonathan had never worn lenses before, and the process of inserting them was more difficult than he had expected. After a few false starts and a few awkward moments where the lens seemed to disappear under his eyelid, he finally got it right. His piercing blue eyes were now replaced by brown ones. "Okay," Jonathan thought. "Now it's time to work on the body." He had been working out hard over the past few weeks, building muscle and shedding the pounds he'd gained from years of sitting at work and lunching for work. His body now looked more like that of an ex-military man looking for a job in security. Jonathan opened his closet and pulled out the clothes he'd secretly purchased for his new look. Plain jeans, a plaid shirt, a distressed leather jacket, all a far cry from his usual designer suits. Once dressed, he looked in the mirror again and barely recognized himself. But something was still missing. Jonathan frowned, trying to figure out what it was. Exactly, it suddenly dawned on him. Posture. Years of being a successful businessman had conditioned him to stand up straight, projecting confidence and strength. Now he needed to learn to slouch, to make his walk less confident, his gestures more awkward. Jonathan spent several minutes practicing in front of the mirror until he achieved the desired effect. The man looking back at him now looked like a typical working man, a little battered by life, but still strong and capable. The finishing touch was a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. Not only did they complete the look, they also helped to hide the distinctive features of Jonathan's face that could give him away. With the transformation complete, Jonathan, now Jack Thornton, sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. The reality of what was happening was finally sinking in. He was about to leave his life, his home, his company. And for what? For suspicions that could only be a figment of his imagination. But then he remembered Emily's strange behavior, Michael's mysterious conversations, the uncertain looks of his employees. No, this couldn't be a coincidence. Something was going on, and he had to find out what it was. Jack stood up and walked over to the safe hidden behind the painting. Opening it, he took out a folder of documents prepared by Richard Hawthorne. It contained everything he needed for his new identity: a driver's license, a military ID, letters of recommendation from previous employers. After examining the documents again, Jack put them in a battered leather wallet, another detail of his new image. Then he took several wads of cash from the safe and distributed them among the pockets of his jacket in the bag he had prepared for his move. Looking around the room one last time, Jack felt a pang of regret. Here, in this house, he had spent so many happy years with Emily. Had it all been an illusion? Pushing the thought aside, he picked up his bag and left the bedroom. As he descended the stairs, Jack tried to move as he imagined Jack Thornton would have moved, a little more awkwardly with a slight limp, as if from a war injury. In the hall, he ran into Martha, an elderly maid who had worked in the house for many years. "Good morning, sir," she began, but then stopped short, looking in surprise at his transformed appearance. Jack cleared his throat, trying to sound lower and rougher than usual. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Jack Thornton, the new security guard. Mr. Blackwood said I could stay here for my trial period." Martha blinked, clearly trying to process the situation. "Oh, yes, of course. Mr. Blackwood warned me that a new member of staff would be arriving. Let me show you to your room." Jack watched the maid's reaction carefully as he followed Martha to a small staff house set back from the garden. She seemed a little tense, but that could simply be due to the new arrival in the house. "Here's your room, Mr. Thornton," Martha said, opening the door to a small but cozy room. "The bathroom is at the end of the hall. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, ma'am," Jack replied with a slight nod. "I appreciate your assistance." Once Martha was gone, Jack closed the door and looked around. The room was simple but clean and functional, the perfect place to begin his investigation. After unpacking his few belongings, Jack sat down on the bed and pulled out his new phone, another piece of his new identity. He dialed the number he knew by heart. "Richard Hawthorne's office. How can I help you?" came the secretary's voice. "This is Jack Thornton. I need to speak with Mr. Hawthorne," Jack said, still getting used to his new voice. A few seconds later, Richard came on the line. "Jack, how did it go?" "Everything is going according to plan," Jack replied. "I'm here, beginning the operation." "Be careful," Richard warned. "And remember, if anything goes wrong, contact me immediately." "Understood. Thanks for everything, Richard." Jack took a deep breath after finishing the conversation. This was the beginning. Now he was about to dive into the world he knew so well, but from a completely new perspective. He was ready to solve the mystery, even if it meant losing everything he had ever known. With a determined look on his face, Jack Thornton walked out of the room, ready to begin his first day as a security guard in his own home. The hunt for the truth had begun. Starting his car, he headed home to begin his transformation into Jack Thornton. A difficult game lay ahead of him, but he was ready to do anything to solve the mystery that had shrouded his life. As Jonathan pulled up to the gates of his estate, he looked at himself in the rearview mirror one last time. "Goodbye, Jonathan Blackwood," he whispered to his reflection. "It's time for Jack Thornton to take the stage." With that, he drove onto the grounds of the mansion, ready to begin the most dangerous adventure of his life. It had been a week since Jack Thornton had taken up his duties as a security guard at the Blackwood estate. In that time, he had settled into his new role and begun his secret investigation. Each day brought new observations and suspicions, but so far, nothing concrete. Today, Jack was patrolling the grounds around the main house when he spotted Emily emerging from her favorite rose garden. She looked anxious and kept glancing around, as if afraid she was being followed. Jack decided to take advantage of the moment. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, bowing his head slightly in greeting. Emily jumped, clearly not expecting to see anyone nearby. "Oh, good morning. Mr. Thornton, was it?" Jack nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "Yes, ma'am. Just checking the grounds. Is everything all right?" Emily tried to smile, but it came out tight. "Yes, of course. Just thinking about my roses. They need a lot of attention this time of year." Jack knew she was lying, but he couldn't figure out why. "I understand, ma'am. They really are beautiful. By the way, I heard that Mr. Blackwood has gone away for treatment. I hope he's all right?" Something like panic flashed in Emily's eyes for a moment, but she quickly collected herself. "Yes, thank you for your concern. Jonathan, he needed a rest. Work, you know." Jack nodded, making a mental note of her reaction. "Of course, ma'am. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Emily nodded quickly and quickly headed towards the house, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. Later that day, Jack was standing outside the main house when he noticed a car pull up. Michael Sterling, the CFO of Quantum Leap Industries, stepped out. Jack tensed, bracing himself for a possible revelation, but Michael merely nodded absently as he passed. Using his position as a security guard, Jack followed Michael quietly, stopping at the door of the office where Michael was meeting with Emily. He listened to their hushed voices. "We can't wait any longer, Emily," Michael was saying. "Time is of the essence. If we don't act now, everything could fall apart." "I know, Michael, but this is risky. What if Jonathan is away and we have to take advantage of it? You do realize this is for his own good, right?" Jack frowned, trying to make sense of what he was saying. What were they talking about? What were they planning to do in his absence? The conversation suddenly stopped, and Jack barely had time to move away from the door when it opened. Michael came out, looking tense and worried. Again, he barely noticed Jack as he hurried to the exit. That evening, sitting in his room, Jack analyzed the events of the day. Emily was clearly hiding something, and her conversation with Michael only confirmed his suspicions. But what exactly was going on? The next morning, Jack decided to check the office of Susan, Jonathan's personal assistant. Taking advantage of the fact that she had gone to lunch, he slipped into the room and began to carefully look through the documents on her desk. Most of the papers seemed like ordinary business documents, but then his attention was drawn to a half-open folder. Inside, he found several pages of financial reports that were clearly different from those he had seen before. The numbers did not add up, and some of the amounts were much larger than they should have been. Jack quickly took a picture of the documents with his phone when he heard footsteps approaching. He barely had time to put everything back and slip out of the room before Susan returned. That evening, as he studied the photos he had taken, Jack felt his anxiety growing. It seemed that someone had been manipulating the company's financial reports. But who and why? The next day, Jack noticed that Frank, the head of security, was acting strangely. He was often absent, making mysterious calls, and seemed more nervous than usual. Taking advantage of his position, Jack offered to cover for Frank at the surveillance post. Left alone in the room with the monitors, he quickly reviewed the camera footage for the past days. In one of the recordings, he saw Frank meeting with an unknown man in a parking lot near the estate. They had a tense conversation, and then Frank handed the man an envelope. Jack frowned. What was that? A bribe? Blackmail? Or something even more serious? By the end of the week, Jack had a list of key suspects. Emily Blackwood. His wife was clearly hiding something and had strange conversations with Michael Sterling. Michael Sterling. The CFO seemed to be at the center of some kind of conspiracy involving the company. Susan. The personal assistant had access to important documents and may have been involved in manipulating financial statements. Frank. The head of security had been engaged in suspicious conversations with unknown individuals. Jack realized that each of them could have their own motives and be involved in different ways. Emily could be acting out of self-interest or under duress. Michael could be trying to seize control of the company. Susan could simply be an enforcer, or she could have deeper ties to the conspiracy. And Frank, what if he was selling information to competitors? Sitting in his room late at night, Jack felt his head spinning with all these theories and suspicions. He was sure he was on to something big, but he couldn't quite put it all together yet. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jack tensed, wondering who could be visiting him so late at night. "Mr. Thornton?" came the quiet voice of Martha, the elderly maid. "Are you awake? I need to talk to you. It's important." Jack opened the door, looking at the agitated woman in surprise. "What's wrong, Mrs. Martha?" Martha looked around as if afraid that they might be overheard. I think I know something. Something about what's going on in this house. and I'm afraid that Mr. Blackwood is in danger." Jack felt his heart beat faster. Was he finally going to get the answers he needed? "Come in, Mrs. Martha," he said, ushering the maid into the room. "Tell me everything you know." Jack listened carefully to Martha's story, feeling that every word she said was bringing him closer to solving the mystery. "I overheard Mr. Sterling and Mrs. Blackwood talking," Martha said in a trembling voice. "They were talking about some kind of plan, about moving quickly before Mr. Blackwood returned. And they mentioned some documents in Mr. Blackwood's safe." Jack frowned. "Do you know what those documents were?" Martha shook her head. "No, but they seemed very important. And also, I saw Mr. Frank handing some papers to a stranger near the estate gates." This information confirmed Jack's suspicions. He thanked Martha, and as soon as she left, he took action. The next morning, Jack quietly entered his former office. He knew the combination to the safe and quickly opened it. Inside, he found a file labeled Project Omega. After quickly scanning the documents, Jack felt his blood run cold. Project Omega turned out to be a plan for a radical restructuring of the company, which included the sale of key assets and mass layoffs. This could lead to the collapse of Quantum Leap Industries. Suddenly, Jack heard footsteps. He barely had time to close the safe and hide behind the curtain when Emily and Michael entered the office. "We have to act now," Michael insisted. "The board of directors meets in 3 days. If we don't present them with a plan, everything is lost." Emily looked uncertain. "But that would destroy everything Jonathan has built. Are you sure there is no other way?" "It's the only way to save the company from total collapse," Michael replied. "Jonathan is too wrapped up in his ambitious projects. He doesn't see that the company is on the verge of bankruptcy." Jack could hardly restrain himself from jumping out of hiding. His own wife and best friend were planning to destroy his life's work. As Emily and Michael left, Jack emerged from behind the curtain, his mind racing. He had to stop them, but then the solution came unexpectedly. Jack remembered his old friend Alex Chen, a well-known investor. He quickly dialed his number. "Alex, I need your help," Jack said, explaining the situation. 2 days later, when the board of directors met to discuss the future of the company, Jack was ready to take the plunge. Michael began his presentation of Project Phoenix by painting a bleak picture of the company's future and the need for radical measures. Blackwood himself walked into the room, to the surprise of everyone present. "Jonathan?" Emily breathed, her face turning pale. "What are you doing here?" Michael looked like he had seen a ghost. Jonathan glanced around the room. "I am here to save my company. From you." He walked up to the table and placed a folder in front of the board of directors. "This is an alternative plan to save Quantum Leap Industries. A plan that does not destroy everything we have built." Michael tried to object, but Jonathan raised his hand, stopping him. "I know about Project Omega, Michael. I know what you and Emily have been planning behind my back." He then turned to the board members. "Gentlemen, may I introduce Mr. Alex Chen." A smartly dressed Asian man walked into the room. "Mr. Chen is willing to invest a significant amount of capital in our company. This will allow us to overcome the current crisis without the need for mass layoffs and the sale of key assets." Over the next hour, Jonathan and Alex presented their plan. The council members listened carefully, asked questions, and finally came to a decision. "Mr. Blackwood, we accept your plan," the chairman of the council announced. "It seems more promising and less risky than Project Omega." Michael looked shocked. "But how? How did you know?" Jonathan looked at his former friend with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. "I was here all along, Michael, right under your nose." With that, he removed his glasses and false beard, revealing his true face. There were surprised gasps in the room. "Jack Thornton," Emily whispered, her eyes widening in shock. Jonathan nodded. I suspected something was wrong and decided to conduct my own investigation. I didn't expect to find a conspiracy orchestrated by my own wife and best friend. Emily looked down. Jonathan, we didn't mean to betray you. We thought we were saving the company. By destroying everything I built? Jonathan asked bitterly. You should have talked to me, not gone behind my back. Michael tried to justify himself. You didn't listen to us, Jonathan. You were so caught up in your new projects that you didn't see the company going down the drain. Jonathan shook his head. That does not excuse your actions. You have betrayed my trust. He turned to the board of directors. Gentlemen, I ask that you accept Mr. Sterling's resignation as CFO. I also recommend that you conduct a full audit of the company to uncover any possible irregularities. The board agreed, and Michael silently left the room, knowing that his career at Quantum Leap Industries was over. After the meeting, Jonathan was alone with Emily. What now? She asked quietly. Jonathan sighed. I don't know, Emily. You have betrayed my trust. We have a lot to discuss and decide if our marriage has a future. Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I understand, and I am willing to fight for our marriage if you give me a chance. Jonathan didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. Perhaps, given time, they could repair what had been destroyed. In the following weeks, Quantum Leap Industries began a restructuring process under Jonathan's leadership and with the support of new investment from Alex Chen. The company slowly but surely emerged from the crisis. Jonathan apologized to his employees for his absence and explained the situation, leaving out personal details. Many were shocked to learn that the new security guard was actually their boss, but this only increased their respect for him. The sun was slowly setting, painting the Boston sky in shades of gold and purple. Jonathan Blackwood stood at the picture window of his office on the top floor of the Quantum Leap Industries skyscraper, looking out over the city below. It had been a year since he had uncovered a conspiracy and saved his company from collapse. A year filled with hard work, difficult decisions, and deep thinking. Quantum Leap Industries had not only survived, it had thrived. Alex Chen's investment and Jonathan's new strategy had paid off. The company had launched several innovative projects that were making waves in the tech world. Jonathan turned to his desk, where a framed photograph lay. It showed him with the company's employees at a recent company picnic. Everyone was smiling, and the atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. It was a far cry from the tense team he had left a year ago. Jonathan had learned a lot from his experience at Jack Thornton. He had become more attentive to his employees, more attentive to their ideas and problems. Weekly meetings with the rank and file had become a mandatory part of his schedule. Jonathan's gaze fell on another photograph of him and Emily at a charity event 2 months ago. Their relationship had gone through a difficult period after the conspiracy was uncovered. There had been long conversations, tears, couples, therapy sessions. But little by little, step by step, they had begun to rebuild trust. Emily took over the company's charitable foundation, channeling her energy and organizational skills into helping others. It helped her find a new purpose in life and begin to make amends with Jonathan. Their marriage was still not perfect, but they worked on it every day. Jonathan understood that a real relationship required constant effort and open communication. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Jonathan said. Susan, his loyal assistant, walked into the office. "Mr. Blackwood, everything is ready for the presentation of the new project tomorrow, and Mr. Chen sent over a report on the latest investment. The results exceeded expectations." Jonathan smiled. "Thank you, Susan. You are as brilliant as always." After Susan left, Jonathan turned back to the window. He remembered Michael Sterling, his former friend and CFO. After Michael was fired, he moved to another city and began working for a small consulting firm. They hadn't spoken since then, but Jonathan hoped that one day they could, if not re-establish their friendship, then at least talk and close this chapter in their lives. Jonathan thought of Martha, the elderly maid whose honesty had helped expose the conspiracy. She had retired a few months ago, but Jonathan was sure that she would be financially secure for the rest of her life. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Emily. "Darling, have you forgotten about our dinner?" she asked. Jonathan smiled. "Of course not. I'm on my way out." After hanging up, he took one last look around his office. A year ago, he had thought he had lost everything: his company, his wife, his trust in people. But now, after all this time, he realized that he had gained so much more. Jonathan Blackwood had learned to value not only success and wealth, but also honesty, trust, and simple human relationships. He realized that real wealth is not measured by the numbers in your bank account, but by the people you surround yourself with and the values you follow. Turning off the light in his office, Jonathan headed for the elevator. Ahead of him was dinner with Emily, a new day in the company and a whole life full of possibilities. And he was ready to meet this life with an open heart and a clear mind. The elevator doors closed, carrying Jonathan Blackwood, a millionaire who had learned to see the world through the eyes of a simple security guard, towards new adventures and achievements.